Thank you, Chair. Can I ask about where festivals take place? So you've recommended that they should happen where there's grid capacity and where there's access to mass public transport, ideally mass electrified public transport. What does that mean in practical terms? Which of the big festivals have to move? Does Glastonbury have to go to Bristol, for example?
So it's not that you would have to move your festival. You could also get a grid connection to your festival, and I think
that's the transport realistically to somewhere like Glastonbury.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to devise transport solutions where you incentivise the lowest carbon options that you have, and you disincentivise the higher carbon versions. So we aren't sort of trying to say that every festival needs to move, but I think if you take this sense of this moment of reassembly, this would be a time to consider, actually, for a long-term low-carbon future, is this the right venue for us? Should we be somewhere else? Right across the sector. But for festivals where their location is really, a central part of their identity, they of course may not want to do that. So then it's about thinking about, can I get a grid connection? And if not, how do I roll out renewable energy options on site that will track the carbon intensity of the grid so that I'm at least as good as if I did have a grid connection?
But so moving from the grid connection, which I understand, but is it really realistic to say you're going to get mass electrified public transport to somewhere like Glastonbury? Reading and Leeds, I can believe that would happen in time, but when will that happen in Glastonbury?
Well, I think, I'm kind of thinking on the hoof a little bit here because we're not making recommendations to particular festivals. I mean, I think Glastonbury have the answer to that. All these problems, all the barriers and issues are best understood by the people that are living with those every day. So I think that, that Glastonbury would give you by far the best answer to how that could be done. But thinking about a context like that, how do you shift much more of the transport demand onto trains, and then how do you shuttle people from train stations in a lower carbon way? That would be a much lower carbon option than allowing or encouraging or making it super easy for lots and lots of people to drive. How do you make that option like the cheapest, funnest, easiest option to do, so that it's not like, maybe I just won't bother going because I'll have to get this kind of transport. It's like, actually, that transport really works brilliantly well, and you get fast-tracked entry, and you get a better place to pitch your tent, and there's lots of things you could do to kind of incentivize that. And you've got to work with the infrastructure that you do have, and so there are train stations that could then and do have shuttles to Glastonbury.
And moving away from that specific case, so obviously many councils have now declared a climate emergency, and they've adopted their own commitments, or we've had zero carbon commitments in many cases, and they also license events to take place. I mean, do you expect there's going to be a very large increase in the number of license refusals as a result of this?
Well, Rob may know more about this than me from the work that they've been doing in Liverpool, but I'll have a bash first. So I think you would expect that logically, wouldn't you? If you've declared a net zero target by 2030 or 2038, then you're going to have to look right across everything that you're doing. I think, in terms of this sort of coalition approach that we've been talking about, how could local authorities work together to challenge and to require a higher level of performance? What's the role of national government in helping that through the Licensing Act or similar? But how could local authorities work together so that they don't have that fear of losing out to a festival because they're holding it to a higher standard? So could there actually be some collaboration, a common approach? If you've declared a climate emergency, these are the things you should be requiring of people holding events in your area.
Thank you. Rob, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Carly was very precise with that answer, to be honest. Thank you.
Thank you. Carly, you mentioned earlier that the term net zero could be sometimes unhelpful, particularly if it kind of deflects from making actual reductions in carbon emissions. I just wonder if, in the case of festivals and other events, if the concept of offsetting is really rather more cosmetic than real, because, as a country, we're trying to plant a lot more trees anyway, regardless of what festivals take place. So, I get the fact that it makes sense to talk about carbon neutrality at a national level, but does it really make sense at the level of one event, or is it something of a nonsense?
Well, I personally am not a fan for some of the reasons you've just outlined, and I think it really helps people to own their emissions and to own the solutions for continuing to reduce those. If you stay on an emissions reduction reporting rather than a we have hit net zero, there's very high carbon activities you can do now that are called carbon neutral. Well, if that is genuinely the case, why would we also need to reduce demand for them? We absolutely do need to reduce demand for them because there are limited availability of these offsets and negative emissions, and there are uncertainties about them delivering. So I think I would much prefer that events, companies, anyone who's talking about carbon reported on its reductions. And if it wants to do offsetting and to maximise other co-benefits from that, meeting sustainable development goals, then for sure report on that too, but keep them separate and show that downward trajectory. And we were talking earlier about greenwashing. I think that would help the audience see that different options are much lower carbon than others, and then that would help to kind of create a bit of a drive to not be a kind of laggard in the sector.
And finally, from me, Chairman, I mean, who in the sector or the academic, in your world, the academic world, is doing the work on what's a realistic target for festivals to get to in terms of carbon reduction? I mean, it does strike me there's a bit of wishful thinking goes on in this, like saying all food should be locally sourced and so on. I mean, how would you run a business that ticked along all year round, and then for sort of 5 days the business went bananas, and then it stopped again for the other 11 3/4 months? I mean, that's why you have businesses that follow big events around the country, music festivals and other things, and you can't wish away that economic reality. Just like you can't wish away the fact that in the countryside around Glastonbury, you're not year round, you're not going to sustain a mass electric transport system. So who's doing the work that sets out what is a realistic target to get to?
So I suppose the idea of realistic depends. I think realistic options for delivery of the target that we have committed to nationally is how I would like to frame it. And so I think, organisations like Julie's Bicycle collect and support examples of best practice. So there's some really good practice going on in the sector and some really great examples of, all these areas, energy, waste, local supply chains. So I think that kind of organisation, sector-led organisation, is able to provide that. But I think one of the things that often happens in climate change discussions is we go to kind of the extremes of like banning, or it couldn't all be local. But there are lots of decisions you could take to make it more local than it is, make it more sustainable than it is. And it's about that journey of saying, well, and what more could we do? And what more could we do on a year-on-year basis? So I think sometimes if you're trying to get to zero straight away, or completely doing something like all local traders in 1 year, that seems very challenging. But can you constantly reassess whether you could do more in these areas where you've got some principles and goals that you want to achieve? Then yes, I think you can do that, and you can shift in that direction significantly and urgently.